Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of DJ Anesh Podcast, proudly brought to you by DJ Anesh. Yep, that's right, we sponsor our own shows because we have no major sponsors currently with us. But hey, good news to everyone. I received a notification from YouTube today that this channel has just crossed a milestone. We now have more than 100 subscribers. Pause for clapping. You're done? Still going on. Okay, clap, clap. Yeah, clap some more. Okay, ready? Okay, good. Yeah, 100 subscribers. Wow, what a milestone and what a way away we've been since the early start of this channel. Of course, I hope that you guys enjoy hearing all these things, but at the same time, I hope that the information that you learn here is meaningful. You can always repeat it, you can slow it down, you can speed it up, you can pause it, it's up to you. But whatever it is over here, I will keep it on the channel. So probably going down the road in J2, you can even pick up back on these nice memories. But more importantly, all the important information that you need to know is always available to you over here. So no worries about things. Now, I know that some of you didn't manage to attend the lecture live, and during the lecture itself, we covered the key learnings of the Manila conference. Originally, I was supposed to do a podcast for that, but seeing that the notes that we gave you, the key learnings of the Manila conference, the one on the write up with the slides, with the key learnings, with the questions for further thinking, as well as the glossary of terms, that package, I thought it was pretty comprehensive already, and pretty much if you read it, you don't really need to listen to another podcast on it, because more or less I think we've been quite elaborated over there. So I thought with regards to this next podcast, what might be more useful for you guys is if I go through into greater detail and provide more help for you guys with regards to the two Decol questions that we set during tutorials and that you guys went through. So if you need further help, I think this is the podcast for you to listen to. Either one of the questions you've chosen is fine. I will go through both of them to give you some guidance as to how you can approach them. So before I go into the questions itself, remember that right now what I'm giving you here is an approach, certain things to consider, certain guidelines, certain structures, but I'm not giving you an answer, I'm not giving you a template. The freedom of the argument still lies with you. The style of your writing is yours. Over here, what I'm doing is just trying to give you some pointers and some direction. Since this is your first essay that you're writing at the JC level, I just want you guys to give it your best. We also want to see the writing style that you guys have and the state of your writing ability, and then after that we can cater better to you guys, our lessons and what we feel would benefit you the best in terms of how to construct arguments. So for Southeast Asia, remember that we are for term 2 we are going to go deep into essay and essay writing. So that's the kind of skills that we'll be more focused over here. So just a recap on the two questions that I've given you guys with regards to Decol. The first one was the Southeast Asian path to independence after 1945 more of a transfer of power or struggle for freedom? The other one is, to what extent was the Decol process in Southeast Asia shaped by the Cold War? I just wanted to you guys to understand why I chose these two questions. Number one, there are two different focus for each of these questions. One of them looks at the characteristics of the Decol process. What was the dominant features of Decol, and who in a sense was driving it as well to some degree. Additionally, when you look at the first question, you will see that there are two views or two perspectives or two factors that are given to you. The first one is the transfer of power. The second one is the struggle for freedom. So one of the things to take note of is question type. So this question type, in terms of its format, gives you two views, and primarily you'll be spending the bulk of the essay and the argument trying to evaluate these two views one against the other one. So that format requires that kind of argumentation. The second question that you have here, to what extent was Decol process shaped by the Cold War? The focus here is really looking at the different agents, the different influences in the Cold War, what's driving it, what kind of actors are out there, what kind of influences are out there, and looking at their relative importance to one another, then trying to judge to see what seemed to be the driving force. With regards to this question, you can see there is only one given factor. So with regards to the question type, the question structure, this one conforms more to a single given factor kind of form for this question. How does that affect the argument is that you really need to focus on this given factor. The ideal situation is that throughout the entire essay, you would be placing huge focus on assessing this given factor. Whether or not you believe it is to a large extent or to a small extent, the focus should be on this given factor. Ideally, you should not run away with the other factors that you identify because that would not be really answering the question. So I'll show you guys some strategies as to how to deal with other factors while still focusing on the given factor. Okay, so if you guys are ready, I'll move on. I do know that some of you are going to be listening to this in class, so as best as I can, I'll try to slow down and stuff. But anytime you need to pause or whatever, just ask whoever's in there, either like Miss Tan or Miss Go, to just pause this if you need it to be so. Okay. Sporadically, I might cough as well because I just drank coffee and there's an acid reflux that I have. So periodically, you're going to be hearing this kind of stuff. It's ASMR. I can do a 10-hour version for you if you want. Just me coughing and putting you to sleep with these soothing sounds. Okay, let's deal with the first question first. The first one that I want to deal with is, to what extent was the Decol process in Southeast Asia shaped by the Cold War? So this was the question that I told you has only one given factor, and we really need to focus our attention on this given factor. Now, the first thing that we should do when we encounter this question, I think, what would be a good approach in terms of the planning to get a sense of the scope and the comprehensiveness of this argument is to acknowledge that there is a given factor already, and you kind of know that you need to deal with that, the Cold War. But it's good to also start to plan what are the other factors that you are going to consider in your argument as well. So starting to identify and to bring in the other factors that are also playing a part in the Cold War, that are also playing a part in decolonization, in that there is some contribution towards it as well. So you can see my suggestion in that star bullet point over there, identify the other forces or agents that are shaping the Decol process as well. So what I want you to do is to get a grand scope of the Decol process, who's involved in it. Right now, we're not really making any assessments or whatever. We are just identifying other forces out there. So because we have to prepare for the scenario of the opposing view. And the opposing view is that if it's not Cold War that is primarily shaping the Decol process, then clearly there are other forces out there that are much larger and more consequential than the Cold War. So what I'll do first in my planning is that I'll try to identify the other factors. Now, the first one is the colonial powers and their non-Cold War motivations and considerations. So what are non-Cold War motivations and considerations? Could be things to do with their domestic economic recovery. It could be things to do with their capacity to hold on to overseas empire. It could also be due to things like the Atlantic Charter, the spirit or the principle of self-determination. So these are all the factors that I want to try to gather first under this point, so I can get an idea of what this factor looks like. And keep in mind that I'm trying to pay very specific emphasis to this factor being a non-Cold War one. So I'm trying to gather points that are not really related to the Cold War in order to set up a good alternative factor and a good alternative point of view. The second one that you could also think about are the Southeast Asian nationalists who are agitating for independence, also based on non-Cold War considerations. Now, quite clearly, what is the driving force over here, if you're thinking about it in non-Cold War terms, is going to be about their desire for independence and self-government and for decolonization. This is something spurred on by nationalism, might also be something spurred on by their frustrations with colonial rule or their newfound confidence after the Japanese occupation and things like that. 'Cause see, all these things, nothing much really to do with the Cold War. Their context lay with something else different. Now, why am I doing this in terms of my argument planning? Because I want to get a grand scope of things as to get a clearer idea on the agents involved in Decol. So right now, and there can be more, I'm just giving you two as an option, but let's say you find more, you can just add to it. But right now, I have three major actors or influences that is responsible for the Decol process. The first one is the given factor, the Cold War. The second one is the colonial powers and their attitudes and their motivations. And the third one are the Southeast Asian nationalists and their desires. The second and third one, with regards to the formulation of the points over there, they are non-Cold War related. Now, as I do my essay planning and now I have these three factors out there, I can start to get a better sense of my own judgment and my own argument. Now that I have these actors laid out before me, I now need to start thinking in more evaluative terms. Now, all of these three factors that you've identified, they are there, they have been identified because of this bolded word over here. And the bolded word over here is that they have some unique importance, they have some unique contribution in shaping the decolonization process. You have identified them because they have some contribution to play, because they have some level of significance. That's why they are there in the first place. So each of these three major factors right now, they all have some role to play in the decol process and in shaping it. That's why all of them have their unique importance of the in contributing to the decol process. So you should acknowledge them and all that, blah blah blah. But okay, here comes the caution or the guidance, which is that if you just leave it like this, right? You've identified three factors, and for each of these factors you state their contribution towards decol and so on and so forth. No evaluation whatsoever. Then it's pretty much going to be looking like a listing of factors. And there isn't really an argument over here. It's more like a collection of things that are responsible for decol. So you wouldn't really have an argument, and you wouldn't really be answering the question as well. So this is just the first stage, but it's an important stage nonetheless, but you can't leave it like this. Now, instead, what you need to start to think about is the higher forms of skills, and primarily these would concern things to do with evaluation. Now, what is really important in evaluation is the understanding of what you are trying to do. Just now we had identified the unique importance of factors. Each of those three had a unique importance attached to them. But now when we start to do evaluation, we are no longer just looking at unique importance, but we are looking at relative importance. Meaning to say that there are some factors that are going to be more important than the other. How do we judge the relative importance of factors? We would need criteria. And on this slide over here, you will see some suggested criteria that you can use in order to make some judgments on these two forces. So, with regards to the three different forces, the Cold War, the colonial powers, the nationalists, which seem to be primarily driving or shaping the Decol process, some points of consideration that you might want to have to use in order to judge between the three. So the first one, what seemed to be the dominant trend across Southeast Asia and across time? Over here, we are looking at the extensiveness of influence and how consistent or sustained it was. So let me give you an example. For instance, if you are leaning towards the statement in the question, you are saying that, yeah, it was primarily shaped by the Cold War. So what you would have to do in your case study evidencing and so on and so forth is you've got to show that this Cold War influence could be seen in the bulk of your case studies. So let's say if you bring about 5 case studies, right? In most, if not all of those case studies that you bring up, you would have to show that the degree of Cold War influence was really large and overshadowed the other forces of decolonization. That would show you the dominant trend across case studies. Now, on top of that, what you can do is also show that this extensiveness of the Cold War influence was across time as well. Now, what does over time mean? It means that right from the beginning, like let's say when in 1945, when the war ends, all the way to the point of independence, when the colonies do get independence, the Cold War consistently played the dominating role in shaping the decolonization process above any and all other factors. So other factors could have been included, they could have emerged, they could have played some sort of role, but the Cold War across time, across all the colonies or most of the colonies, played the dominating role. So what we are doing here is really looking at the region as a whole. We are looking at the time period as a whole, and we are making this overall overarching stand that the Cold War was extensive in its influence and it was also consistent in its influence far beyond the other two motivating factors. That's the first one. The second one, which seemed to have the more direct impact on the decolonization process, this one we are looking at the degree of impact, the significance of their impact, how much did it shape the process in terms of direct effects that it had on the Southeast Asian colonies and their decolonization processes. So for instance, again, giving you another example, if you are leaning towards the Cold War and so on, and you want to show direct impact, let's say you want to look at a case study like Vietnam or Indonesia. Well, the Cold War, because of Cold War considerations, and the extent of the communist presence, that it was quite large in those two countries. The direct impact is that it immediately and very quickly escalated things into confrontation and, in fact, warfare in those two countries. So, could the colonial non-Cold War motivations result in this? Did it result in this? It didn't, right? The nationalists, when they had their desire for independence and all that, did it first come to confrontation immediately? Remember, I did make a mention that many of these nationalists were willing to negotiate at first. But it seems that the Cold War changed things. This impact factor that they have, this direct impact factor that they have, could be an indication of how large, how dominating this influence was above like the rest. The third one, which seemed to be the most immediate, the pressing, urgent concern in decolonization considerations. So this one is looking at the different considerations, seeing how close they are to the effects. Give you an example. Let me try to take the other side of the stance. The other side of the argument. Maybe I want to say that I disagree with the statement, and I say that while the Cold War might have been a global event, and bipolarity was extensive in its influence and so on, at this point in time, I could make an argument that it is only still at the emerging stages. However, what was more immediate or pressing or urgent was the European desire for economic recovery, or it could be the nationalist desire for independence. Now, those things were happening at that point in time. It was seen, it was concretized, it was tangible as compared to the Cold War at that point in time in the early phases where it was still in more abstract terms. So I think that's something that you can also consider, especially if you want to take the opposing view of non-Cold War concerns. The last one is which seem to be the foundation or the core in its influence and its impact. Sometimes, even between these three factors that we've identified, the Cold War, the colonial powers, the nationalists, even between these three factors that we've identified, maybe we can establish a relationship among them. Like one is more foundational, more core than the other ones. In fact, because of this foundational or core factor, it might have led on to the other two factors, for instance. So that could be a primary, secondary effect kind of situation. And of course, if you have a primary and a secondary effect situation, then obviously the primary, the core, the foundation, that factor is going to be the one that is more primary in shaping the decolonization process. So criteria is something for you to consider because this is what we want to achieve, which is the relative importance of factors. We want to establish a relationship. We want to establish a evaluative relationship of factors against each other so that we can have a good sense of an evaluated argument rather than just a listing of the factors. So I've given you a sample over here. The sample over here, I have leaned towards, I've leaned towards the Cold War side. Okay, so let me go through with you. While it should be acknowledged that the colonial powers had economic considerations that determine aspects of decolonization process. So this first part here is acknowledging the unique importance of the alternative factors, the non-Cold War factors. I acknowledge that they have some role to play. However, Cold War considerations grew more extensive in its influence, so a bit of a time factor over here. It starts to grow more extensive or intense in its influence across time, affecting most Southeast Asian decolonization experiences. So most, I'm looking at dominant trends over here. And that's one of my criteria. Sometimes even overturning initial economic assessment. So I'm relating it back to my earlier point, the non-Cold War motivations, and I want to show how Cold War motivations could have overridden those non-Cold War ones. Now, if I can show a reversal of decisions, a reversal of non-Cold War stuff, that really shows me a huge impact from the Cold War influences because it has the ability to overturn certain initial decisions. Now, that's really a showcase of the power and the strength of that factor. Additionally, it can also be proven that the Cold War held a foundational impact in that even the economic considerations could be traced back to Cold War considerations. Remember the foundational, the primary, secondary kind of relationship that we want to establish? Over here, we are saying that the economic considerations is not simply an end itself, but perhaps it's a means towards an end. The European recovery could have also been linked to the Cold War because they wanted to ensure economic stability against Cold War expansion, communist expansion. So that could be drawn a link as well using the foundational, the primary, secondary kind of relationship thing. Now, the last thing I'll caution you guys as you attempt this essay is that, remember, going back to the start, this is a single factor question. So the bulk of the essay should really focus on this assessment of this single factor. Now, what this means is that you can bring in other factors, like as I did, I brought in the colonial powers, I brought in the nationalists as well. I can bring in other factors, but you can't let these things start to dominate the essay, because if you run away with these factors, then you wouldn't really be focused on the question. So what is the purpose of bringing in these other factors? These other factors are brought in order to confirm something about the given factor. And that something about the given factor is actually your stand on the given factor. So let's say, for instance, if you agree with the statement and you say that I agree to the Cold War to a large extent, you can bring in other factors, but the purpose of it is to showcase how these other factors pale in comparison to the Cold War factor, thereby further confirming that the Cold War was primary in shaping the Decol process. Now, conversely, if you disagree with this statement and you say, I agree to a small extent that the Cold War shaped the Decol process, and you want to bring in these other factors, right? So these other factors, you can showcase their dominance. You can showcase that these non-Cold War factors were much more dominant and influential than the Cold War ones. But you shouldn't run off with these other factors even though they are dominant. Instead, what you should try to do is that in showing their dominance, you have to redirect it back to your assessment on the Cold War, further confirming that the Cold War had a limited influence in the decolonization process. So you have to redirect it. The key word here is redirect. You have to redirect it back to your initial assessment that the Cold War was limited or had a small extent in its impact. So it must be brought back to the given factor. So that's why I think I've spoken to some classes about this. Answer the question. It seems simple enough, but actually there's a skill to it. You really must be focused on the demands of the question. Okay? Okay. Now, I hope that helped a bit with the first question, and now I'm going to be moving on to the second question. Now, the second question is this: was the Southeast Asian path to independence after 1945 more of a transfer of power or a struggle of freedom? Now, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this podcast, the nature, the structure of the question, the form of the question is different. The question type is different, right? Here we are looking at two-factor, a two-view, a two-perspective kind of question, and the central competition, the central contestation will be between these two factors. So the bulk load of the essay has to be really focused on the comparison between was it this or was it the other thing. And ideally, the comparison would be consistent throughout the essay. So what this means is that the entirety of the essay should be focused on the contestation of two perspectives. It is necessary to find different points of comparison to evaluate between the two. So once again, you can't escape from this. You will need to set certain criteria. You will need to set certain basis of comparison in order to weigh the two against one another, to evaluate the two against one another, to see which was really more representative of the Southeast Asian decolonization process. Now, two-factor questions, I do advise that you guys really focus on the two factors. But if you've managed to seek a nuance, if you manage to find a nuance, that means to say that if you manage to find something that you can modify to give a third perspective, can this situation be run Yes, I think it can, and if you do it well, actually it might really elevate your argument to a higher level. However, there are two things I will need to caution you if you do try to attempt something like this. Now, the first thing that you would need to be wary about is be careful that in coming up with this third perspective or this insight that you have, be careful that it doesn't contradict anything that you had said previously about the central competition between the two given factors. So this third thing, your language must be quite meticulous and be careful that it doesn't contradict anything that your argument has run all the way thus far. So that's the level of skill that you would need in order to come up with something like this. Not just having that idea, but also making sure that it doesn't contradict what you had said about the two given factors. So that's the number one caution. The number two caution is that I would still suggest at this stage, especially as you guys are still in J1 and figuring like stuff out, my suggestion is that we focus on the more direct answering of the question. We are looking at the two views that they are giving us, and we're trying to reconcile them and evaluate them against one another. So my second caution is that should be settled first. If you want to attempt anything like a third perspective or a nuance, I suggest that you leave it to somewhere near the end of the essay, and it might be housed in a separate paragraph by itself, evaluative by nature. It might even be some sort of a conclusion of sorts. But so these are the two things that I would caution in case you are thinking of having a third perspective. In terms of how you want to argue, this last point over here, in terms of how you want to craft your argument for this question, in my mind right now, there are two types that you can consider. The first one is what I would term. These are all my terms. You can learn my language in this sense. You probably won't find it anywhere else, but yeah. Anyway, the first form of argument that you might have is what I call the dominant trend type of argument. So meaning to say, between these two views, you are going to lean onto one of them. You can acknowledge that for certain unique, exceptional case studies, it might be something, but the dominant trend, once again, criteria, the dominant trend across Southeast Asia actually evidences the something else. So, give example, for instance, a dominant trend argument could be like, when you look at the entirety of Southeast Asia in the decolonization processes, the various experiences and all that, what seemed to characterize them more of was that of a transfer of power. However, for the unique case study of Vietnam, it represented more of a struggle for freedom. Okay, so this can be something of an overall stand. Then after you can go and explain why is this a situation. So that's more of a dominant trend kind of argument where you really showcase that the dominant trend across Southeast Asia is represented by one of these two. There may be an exception or certain exceptions for the other one, but the dominant trend lies with one of these two. The second type of argument is not that clean cut, especially if your case studies are a lot more complex and not so straightforward as they seem. So the second type of argument, that's what I'm going to call the determinant type of argument. The determinant type of argument, right, it can be a situation where there is, in terms of case studies, there might not be a dominant trend situation. There might in fact be a 50-50 split. So let's say if you are bringing in 6 case studies, and your assessment of these 6 case studies, it's an even split of 3-3. 3 for transfer of power and 3 for struggle for freedom. Then you can't run the dominant trend argument then, because there isn't a dominant trend. 3-3, #quick math. You can see that there isn't a dominant trend. And so what you need to do then is a determinant type of argument. So don't try to force fit the numbers, that situation. You can leave it as 3-3. You can run your argument like that, but you got to come up with the list of determinants, the list of reasons that account for why these 3 case studies are under the transfer of power trend and why the other 3 case studies are under the struggle for freedom trend. So it's identifying determinants, identifying reasons as to why they are as such, and your argument will pretty much run like this, looking and exploring and explaining the reasons why they are so complex and so nuanced that for some case studies it's like that, for other case studies is the other way. With regards to which argument you want, that one I'll leave it up to you guys. Now this one I went through a bit in class with you guys. So one of the key things in this question, because there are two manner of phrasings, one is transfer of power, the other one struggle for freedom. It doesn't necessarily immediately explain itself. So you do need to set definitions and so on. I think the consistent thing that I've said in class is that at the JC level, when you set definitions, it's usually not going to be a one-liner, right? It's not going to be like just one thing that it equates to. Usually what's going to happen is that with definitions, there are several components, or there are several elements, or there are several dimensions to a definition. So it's best to dig a bit deep and try to get as comprehensive an understanding as you can of the terms first before you go into writing the essay itself. So over here, I've given you all some suggestions. I've kind of been through this in class already, so I'm not going to really go into it. But with regards to the two key terms here, transfer of power, these are the things that it entails. The second one, struggle for freedom, these are the other things that it entails. I did mention to, I think, J14 that a crucial element here, the key difference between transfer of power and struggle for freedom is with the issue of agency. Where does agency lie with regards to the decolonization process? Is it in the firm control of the colonial powers? Is it an agenda that is being driven and being run by the nationalists? And things like that. So one of the key differentiating points, it's where does agency lie, among other differentiating points. With regards to the criteria, it's again something that we need to think about, and here I have some suggestions with regards to how you can judge between whether it's more of a transfer of power or whether it's a struggle for freedom. The first one, it kind of links back to the earlier question, the first question. It's quite similar, this criteria, and you can start to see that this criteria, because we are doing a Southeast Asian study, we are doing a regional study, this criteria will pop up in almost every essay that you have across any topic across the 2 years that we are going to study Southeast Asia. So this criteria is quite useful. I think it's good for you guys to quickly come to grasp with it so that you can use it and utilize it the best you can. So the criteria, what seem to be the dominant trend across Southeast Asia and across time, which better characterize the Decol experience as a whole, which was more representative of decolonization in Southeast Asia. Again, this looks at dominant trend across space, which means across the Southeast Asian countries, as well as across time, which looks at the entirety of the Decol period from 1945 all the way to the point of independence of the respective countries, so which seem to characterize the decolonization process more. So I think this is one of the key criteria that you definitely will need to consider when you start to evaluate between the two. The second one, what seem to be the dominant attitudes of the colonial external actors, was it consistent? So a huge determinant as to whether it will be a transfer of power or a struggle for freedom is the colonial attitudes. Are they willing to decolonize, or are they thinking more in their own self-interest and so on and so forth, that would actually set about the foundation for the Decol experience. I put this follow-up question here. Was it consistent? It's because I wanted you to see and to assess also across a time-based consideration. Did it change over time? So a colonial attitude could be attitude A at the start, but somewhere across the timeline, somewhere across the Decol timeline, it changed because of something or another. So did that then change the character of the decolonization experience? So you can even look at time evolutions like this, and you can see how the decol experience changed uh, across the decolonization duration itself. The third one, what seemed to be the state and nature of nationalism in the colony, its preparedness for independence, also same thing, was it consistent? Now, again, this one looks at it more from the Southeast Asian point of view. What could have determined, whether it's a transfer of power or struggle for independence, could have been down to the state of preparedness of the colony. And sometimes, right, guys, it's not just about the extent of communist influence, because I know right now in your minds you're thinking about that. Oh, how threatening are the communists? How unstable is the country because of the communist threat, and so on and so forth. Yeah, it might not always, the state of preparedness, it might not always come down to that, because we have other considerations as well, which is that, is there even a political elite to speak of? Meaning to say that, is there even a local government in waiting? What is the state of the economy in the colony? Is it really ready for independence, economically speaking? Can it sustain itself? You look at a country like Singapore, for instance. Actually, you take a look at Singapore's decolonization time frame. Let's say we take it from 1945 all the way to the point where we joined the Federation of Malaysia, 1963. Now that's a total period of 18 years. Hashtag quick math. Now that's a total period of 18 years. And you might think that all these 18 years is dragged on by the colonial powers and blah blah blah. Okay lah, to some degree that's true. But our politicians, our local elite politicians back then, I think they were also very aware that the country was not ready for independence, and it kind of needed a longer runway, needed a longer time. So the state of preparedness is not just something set by the colonial powers, but it could also be something set by the nationalists themselves. Some of them just in their calculations, in their strategic calculations, in their political calculations, just deem it necessary to have a longer decolonization time. But this decolonization time, even though it's long, is still characterized by collaboration, negotiation, peace. So a longer time doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. It could be because of local conditions that determine the extent of it. So you can also look at the urgency of situations, the urgency of the context. It could determine whether it is a transfer of power or a struggle for freedom as well. And with the last 3 points, right, over here, was it consistent? Was it consistent? And the last point over here, did the nature of decol experience evolve over its duration? I'm looking at time-based considerations over here to see that if you want to aim for like a higher level of argumentation, maybe you would want to introduce the idea that decolonization wasn't, it wasn't simply this or that. It might have evolved over time because of certain determinants, because of certain things changing. So you're introducing an added layer of complexity, you're introducing an added layer of sophistication by saying that, oh wait, it's not a one-track thing. It actually did change over time because of certain issues, certain developments. And that brought a lot of nuance to our understanding of the decol process. So that's something that's possible as well. Of course, if you feel that that's a bit too difficult for you right now, it's fine. Right? Let's run the straight argument first. It's okay. It's perfectly well. You can get a good mark for that, and so on and so forth. Just at your own comfort level, see what you like to experiment with. Okay. Okay, guys. I think that that's all I have for you in terms of guidance and all that. With regards to the instructions for your submission of these essays and all,
The baseline is that you try to use your March holidays to do this, and then with regards to the specific formatting and all that kind of stuff, I will let your history reps know, and they will send you the information. Okay, so I hope you enjoy yourselves, and I hope that this was useful. Peace out.